Baltimore County Police Department files regarding case number 991006-747 open, with a missing persons report filed on January 13th, 1999. The subject of the report was Hae Min Lee, a senior at Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County, Maryland. To understand the trajectory of the investigation that followed, one must first examine the documentary evidence established prior to that date. The context of this case is built upon school attendance records, handwritten diary entries, cellular telephone logs, and witness statements collected in the weeks following the disappearance. Woodlawn High School in 1999 was a large, diverse institution housing a magnet program for gifted students. Both the subject of the missing persons report and the primary person of interest, Adnan Sid, were enrolled in this program. According to academic transcripts, both students were high achievers. Teachers described Lee as responsible and athletic, a member of the field hockey and lacrosse teams, and the manager of the boys' wrestling team. These extracurricular commitments are vital to the timeline because they created a rigid schedule of whereabouts that investigators would later rely upon to establish the window of opportunity for the fatal incident. The relationship between Lee and Sid is documented extensively through primary sources recovered by investigators. A diary belonging to Lee, which became a central piece of evidence, detailed a relationship that began in the spring of 1998. The entries depict a dynamic that was kept hidden from their respective families due to cultural and religious expectations. Investigators noted that this secrecy added a layer of complexity to their social interactions, as they relied on a system of pager codes and leaving a trail of communication that would later be scrutinized. By late 1998, the relationship had deteriorated. Records indicate a breakup occurred in November, followed by a brief reconciliation, and then a final separation in December. A letter written by Lee to Sid during this period was recovered from Sid's residence during a later search. In the letter, Lee expressed frustration with the difficulty of the breakup. A specific detail noted by forensic examiners was the presence of a handwritten phrase at the top of this note, penned in different ink, which read, "I am going to take a life." The authorship and timing of this specific annotation became a subject of intense debate during the legal proceedings, with the defense arguing it was a figure of speech regarding a joke, while the prosecution presented it as evidence of premeditation. Following the dissolution of the relationship with Sid, Lee began dating an older individual named Don, who worked with her at a LensCrafters store at the Owings Mills Mall. Time cards secured from LensCrafters confirmed their overlapping shifts. Lee's diary entries from January 1999 reflect a new romantic interest and a sense of optimism. On the evening of January 12th, the night before the disappearance, phone records indicate that Sid called Lee 3 times. The first 2 calls, placed at 11:27 at night and 12:01 in the morning, were of short duration, lasting mere seconds. The third call, placed at 12:35 in the morning, lasted approximately 1 minute and 24 seconds. During later interviews, Sid stated these calls were to give Lee his new cellular telephone number. The acquisition of this cellular telephone is a critical procedural detail. Records from AT&T show that the account was activated on January 12th, 1999, under the name of Bilal Ahmed, an associate of Sid. The device was a Nokia 6160. In 1999, cellular technology was not ubiquitous among high school students. The existence of this phone allowed investigators to map the movements of the device through cell tower pings, a forensic method that was relatively novel in courtrooms at the time. This specific phone log would become the spine of the state's timeline. January 13th, 1999, began as a routine Wednesday for the students of Woodlawn High School. According to attendance records and witness statements collected during the subsequent investigation, Hae Min Lee arrived at the campus on time. She was 18 years of age and maintained a schedule that was heavily documented. The timeline of this specific day would eventually become the central focus of a criminal inquiry that spanned decades, hinging on a window of time totaling less than 60 minutes. The early hours of the day proceeded without noted incident. School records indicate that Lee attended her morning classes. Her first period was advanced placement psychology, starting at 7:45 in the morning. Sid arrived late to his first period class, arriving at approximately 10:45 in the morning. One specific interaction noted in the investigation files occurred during her first period photography class. A classmate recalled seeing Lee carrying a disposable camera, an item that would later be cataloged, but would yield no evidentiary value regarding the events of that afternoon. According to statements provided to detectives, a significant interaction occurred during the second period, or the lunch hour. A witness, Krista, told police she heard Sid ask Lee for a ride home after school because his car was in the shop. This statement is contentious. Other witnesses provided conflicting accounts of whether Lee agreed or declined, citing her obligation to pick up her young cousin. Sid's own vehicle, a Honda Accord, was not actually in the shop. According to later testimony from an acquaintance named Jay Wilds, Sid had lent the vehicle and his new cell phone to Wilds during the midday hours. The academic day at Woodlawn High School concluded at 2:15 in the afternoon. of time between the final bell and the scheduled pickup of Lee's cousin is the most scrutinized interval in the entire investigation. According to the standard routine verified by family members, Lee was responsible for driving from the high school to Campfield Early Learning Center to pick up her cousin by 3:15. The drive takes approximately 15 minutes. This left a gap of roughly 45 minutes unaccounted for. Witness testimony places Lee at the school immediately following the bell. Inez Butler, who ran the concession stand at the gym, told investigators she saw Lee shortly after 2:15. Lee purchased a snack and apple juice. Butler noted that Lee seemed in a hurry and mentioned she had to pick up her cousin. This is the last independent verification of Lee's presence by a non-involved party. Another witness known as Debbie stated to police that she saw Lee at approximately 3 o'clock near the gymnasium. Debbie claimed she spoke with Lee, who mentioned the cousin pickup. This statement directly contradicts the timeline later constructed by the prosecution, which posited that Lee had already been intercepted by that time. Simultaneously, the movements of Sid's phone were being logged by the AT and T network. At 2:36 in the afternoon, an incoming call was registered on Sid's cell phone, pinging a tower consistent with the Woodlawn area. The prosecution would later argue this was the signal that the plan was in motion or completed. However, the identity of the caller remains unverified in the official file, as incoming calls were not itemized on the billing statement. At 3:15 in the afternoon, Lee failed to arrive at the Campfield Early Learning Center. This deviation from routine was immediate cause for alarm. The family, described in reports as extremely close-knit, knew that Lee took her familial responsibilities seriously. When she did not arrive, the school contacted the family. By 5:12 that evening, the Lee family had contacted the Baltimore County Police Department. Officer Scott Adcock was the initial responding officer. His actions that evening established the first official documentation of the investigation. Adcock began calling Lee's known associates. At 6:24 in the evening, Officer Adcock spoke with Sid by telephone. In his report, Adcock noted that Sid admitted to asking Lee for a ride earlier that day, but stated that he got detained and she presumably left without him. This admission, placing himself with the intent to be in her vehicle, was recorded in the initial police report. Days later, Sid would contradict this statement, telling a different investigator that he owned his own car and would not have needed a ride. The investigation into the disappearance stalled almost immediately due to environmental factors. On January 14th and 15th, a severe ice storm struck the Baltimore area, closing schools and effectively halting physical searches or extensive canvassing. This weather event created a procedural gap, delaying the discovery of physical evidence and allowing potential leads to cool. For several weeks, the case was treated as a runaway situation. Police interviews with friends referenced Lee's prior mentions of wanting to go to California. This assumption arguably slowed the mobilization of a major crimes unit. During this interim period, forensic analysis of the environment was minimal. No crime scene had been identified. The vehicle, a 1998 Nissan Sentra, was missing. Without a location or a subject, the police relied on canvassing. They spoke to Don, the new boyfriend, who provided an alibi supported by LensCrafter's manager credentials. They continued to monitor financial activity on Lee's accounts, which showed zero activity after January 13th. It was not until February 9th, 1999, nearly 4 weeks after the disappearance, that the status of the case shifted from a missing person inquiry to a criminal investigation involving a fatality. A maintenance worker, referred to in reports as Mr. S, paused his vehicle on Franklintown Road to enter Leakin Park for a restroom break. While walking into the wooded area, roughly 127 feet from the road, he observed what appeared to be human hair visible above the surface of the soil. Investigators arrived at the location, now designated as the primary site connected to the case. The recovery process was complex. The individual had been placed in a shallow depression behind a large log, partially concealed by earth and leaves. The autopsy report, conducted by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, provided clinical details regarding the cause of the loss of life. The examiner determined that the individual had succumbed to manual compression of the neck. The report noted hemorrhaging in the strap muscles and a fracture of the hyoid bone, findings consistent with the application of force. There were also 2 areas of trauma to the head, specifically on the right temporal and occipital areas, suggesting blunt force injury prior to or during the fatal incident. Procedural analysis of the autopsy findings introduced questions regarding the timeline of the burial. The medical examiner noted the presence of livor mortis, or lividity, which is the settling of blood in the lower portion of the body after the heart stops pumping. The autopsy report stated that lividity was fixed on the anterior, or front, of the torso. This biological marker indicates that the individual lay face down for a significant period immediately following the cessation of life, allowing the blood to pool and fix in that position. However, investigators noted that the individual was discovered buried on her right side. This discrepancy between the fixed anterior lividity and the right side burial position suggests that the burial in Leakin Park may not have occurred at the time the prosecution later alleged, implying that the individual was kept in a face-down position for 8 to 12 hours before being moved to the final location. This forensic conflict was not fully reconciled in the initial trial records. 3 days after the discovery in Leakin Park, on February 12th, the Baltimore City Homicide Division received an anonymous telephone call. The caller advised investigators to examine Adnan Sid, suggesting a motive rooted in the dissolution of their relationship. This prompt led detectives to subpoena the cell phone records of Sid. This decision marked the transition of the case from a traditional inquiry into a technologically driven investigation. The subpoena yielded a log of calls made and received on January 13th. Investigators focused on the sheer volume of activity. 34 calls were registered to the device that day. The doctrine of evidence in this case relies heavily on the interpretation of these logs. Detectives noted 2 critical elements: the phone numbers dialed and the cell towers that routed the signals. This data provided a geographic and chronological framework that the police attempted to populate with witness statements. By analyzing the call log, detectives identified a high frequency of calls to a number listed as Jen. This lead brought them to Jennifer Pusateri. On February 26th, Pusateri was brought in for questioning. During her interview, she stated that she had received calls from Sid's phone, but claimed the device was in the possession of Jay Wilds during the relevant time frame. Pusateri told detectives that Wilds had confided in her that Sid had been involved in the death of Lee. This statement provided the necessary leverage for investigators to interview Jay Wilds. On February 28th, detectives brought Wilds into the station. The interrogation was not recorded in its entirety. The files indicate a pre-interview phase of undetermined length before the tape recorder was activated. This procedural gap has been cited by independent observers as a point where contamination of the narrative could have occurred. When the recording began, Wilds became the primary cooperating witness. He alleged that Sid had lent him his vehicle and cell phone earlier in the day. According to Wilds, he received a call from Sid later that afternoon demanding to be picked up. Wilds stated he drove to the parking lot of a Best Buy retailer, where Sid showed him the individual in the trunk of the Nissan Sentra. He further alleged that they later transported the individual to Leakin Park for concealment. It is important to note the condition of the investigation prior to Wilds' involvement. There was no forensic link connecting Sid to the disappearance. There was no DNA evidence processed at that stage. The case was entirely circumstantial. The introduction of the cell phone records provided the lattice upon which the state would eventually construct its theory. 2 specific incoming calls on the evening of January 13th became the cornerstone of the state's case. At 7:09 in the evening and 7:16 in the evening, the cell phone received calls that pinged a tower identified as L689B. According to the network maps provided by AT&T engineers, this sector covered the area of Leakin Park. The prosecution utilized this data to place the phone, and by extension, the suspect, at the location of the burial during the time they alleged the concealment of the individual was taking place. However, a procedural oversight regarding the reliability of this evidence later emerged. A disclaimer sheet attached to the faxed records from AT&T explicitly stated that incoming calls were not reliable for determining location status. This document noted that while outgoing calls identify the tower from which the signal originates, incoming calls can be routed through switches that do not necessarily reflect the physical location of the handset. This technical nuance was either overlooked or disregarded during the initial legal proceedings. Following the interview with Wilds, the investigation moved to secure physical evidence. On February 28th, Wilds led detectives to the location of Lee's vehicle, which was found parked in a grassy lot behind row houses on Edgewood Road, approximately 15 minutes from the high school. The vehicle was processed for forensic evidence. Technicians dusted for fingerprints and vacuumed for trace materials. The latent print examination report noted that fingerprints belonging to Sid were found on a map book in the rear seat and on the floral paper covering a wiper lever. However, as Sid had been a frequent passenger in the vehicle during their relationship, the presence of his prints was not definitive proof of his presence on the day of the incident. Significantly, no soil samples from the wheel wells of the Nissan were matched to the soil in Leakin Park, and no physical evidence linking Wilds to the interior of the car was recorded. The investigation exhibited signs of tunnel vision regarding the timeline. The state required the fatal event to occur between 2:15, when school ended, and 2:36, when the alleged pickup call occurred. This 21-minute window was extremely narrow. It required Lee to leave campus, undergo an interception, and succumb to the assault, all before the phone call was placed. Investigators did not thoroughly pursue the potential alibi provided by a student named Asia McLean, who claimed to have seen Sid in the library until at least 2:40. This statement was not included in the primary investigative file used to build the case for arrest. Another record of significance is a note found in Lee's vehicle. It was addressed to her current boyfriend, Don. The note appeared to be intended for placement on his car, suggesting she planned to see him that day. However, the note was never delivered. Investigators also noted that on February 12th, the Baltimore City Homicide Division received an anonymous telephone call advising them to look at Sid. But they also possessed handwritten notes detailing two separate individuals who were potential alternate suspects. One note described a threat made against Lee by a different individual, stating that he would make her disappear. This information was not disclosed to the defense at the time. On February 28th, 1999, in the early hours of the morning, authorities executed an arrest warrant for Adnan Sid at his home. The affidavit for the warrant relied heavily on the statements provided by Jay Wilds and the corroboration of the cell tower pings. The investigation, for all intents and purposes, concluded its information-gathering phase and transitioned into case building for trial. The legal proceedings that followed were marked by distinct phases of procedural argumentation. The first trial commenced in December 1999, but ended in a mistrial. The second trial began in January 2000. The defense, led by Christina Gutierrez, failed to utilize the potential alibi witness, Asia McLean. On February 25th, 2000, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Sid was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. For more than a decade, the case remained legally dormant. In 2010, a petition for post-conviction relief was filed. This initiated a long sequence of hearings regarding the failure to contact the alibi witness and the reliability of the cell tower evidence. By 2016, a lower court judge vacated the conviction, citing the defense attorney's failure to cross-examine the cell tower expert regarding the disclaimer about incoming calls. The state appealed, and while the Maryland Court of Special Appeals upheld the decision to vacate, the highest court in Maryland eventually reinstated the conviction in 2019. However, the investigation into the files continued. In 2022, a new review of the evidence by the state's attorney's office for Baltimore City uncovered significant Brady violations. Specifically, the withheld notes regarding alternate suspects and the fact that the location where the car was discovered was known to be associated with one of them. Furthermore, the integrity of the physical evidence was re-examined using modern technology. Items recovered from the individual, including fingernail clippings and clothing, were subjected to advanced DNA testing that was not available during the original investigation. The reports returned a result that excluded Adnan Sid. The DNA profile found on the shoes did not match him. Based on the discovery of the Brady violation and the lack of confidence in the integrity of the conviction was vacated on September 19th, 2022. On October 11th, 2022, the state entered a nolle prosequi, formally dropping all charges against Sid. The procedural aftermath continues. The family of the individual involved filed an appeal, arguing their rights were violated because they were not given adequate notice to attend the vacatur hearing. In March 2023, the Appellate Court of Maryland reinstated the conviction on these procedural grounds, ordering a new hearing to correct this error. As of the most recent records, the case remains in a state of complex flux. The conviction was technically reinstated to allow for a compliant hearing, but the underlying evidence, the DNA exclusions, the unreliable cell tower data, and the withheld information regarding alternate suspects remains part of the official record. The investigation into the death of Hae Min Lee stands as a testament to the power of circumstantial assembly and the fragility of procedural justice. There was no DNA linking the suspect to the individual. There was no video surveillance of the abduction. There was no weapon recovered. The case was built entirely upon the intersection of a newly popular technology and the shifting narrative of an alleged accomplice. The investigation is currently classified as open and ongoing. No other arrests have been made, and the source of the DNA found on the evidence remains unknown. The narrative of January 13th is thus constructed not from a continuous stream of facts, but from disparate data points and a timeline that remains disputed decades later.